So obviously the best beard at Pros. Thank you, Seraine. So yeah, I'm Justin Jander. Been at Pros for about 7 years, and we're going to talk about O&D and where we're going in the future. So there's a couple things that we're going to talk about. So the roadmap really means a couple different things. The roadmap has things that we're doing in the near term and things that are more visionary, things of a couple years down the road. Where do we see us going in the long term? And so my team and I, we're responsible for all of the different things that go in and out of the product. So we take all the ideas from our customers, we take ideas from our professional services team, and we take all these ideas and we try to understand what can we put in the product in the near term, as well as what can we put in the product long term that both satisfy all of the needs that we have out there in the industry. So I'm kind of breaking up the presentation today into those two different parts. So we'll have the upcoming O&D enhancements that we're making, and then we'll talk a little bit later about some of the long-term vision for the product. So from an upcoming standpoint, I'm going to show you 3 features today. That's not all that we're going to do in the product. We're doing much more than just 3 things in O&D. But I wanted to highlight 3 of the really key, important developments that we're making that really help us out as we move forward. And one important thing is O&D is a tried and true product. It's something that has been established around. Many of you out there are users of O&D, and you know that it provides a lot of value, and we definitely know that. So when you see these enhancements, you're going to say, they seem like, well, that's a good thing. Why haven't you done it already? Well, we're really talking about now moving into that incremental value that we can provide, taking the next step and adding the additional value that O&D doesn't already provide today. So you'll see some of that as we walk through. So the first thing that we're going to look at is, there we go, is our new customer choice model. And so the customer choice model is one thing you'll find as we go through these, we're really great at naming things at Pros. So the customer choice model is a model that helps us determine the choices that a customer makes. So customer choice model, yeah, all right. So the idea behind it is to scientifically determine how passengers make choices how passengers make choices. So when we're distributing forecasts down to a lower level of detail, we use science instead of just using basic formulas. So that's a quick high-level thing. Let's talk about what it really means in more detail. So at Pros, in our system, we forecast at a path level, a path time of day level. We don't forecast down to the exact itineraries that would fly. And that's a matter of convenience so that we don't end up forecasting individual flight numbers, and when those flight numbers change, then you lose all that rich history that you had, and we definitely don't want to do that. So if a flight changes by 5 minutes, it doesn't really mean that the passenger behavior has changed. So we want to forecast at that higher level of detail. So in this example, we're flying Houston to Chicago, very fitting. And we have a departure time from 8 a.m. to around 10 a.m. And so I have this group of passengers that I need to distribute down to a set of itineraries. So these are my 4 itineraries that I have. I have my 8 a.m. flight, an 8:30 flight, a 9 a.m. flight, and a 9:30 flight. So I've got to figure out how to take this set of passengers that I forecasted at a higher level of detail and distribute them down to the lower level of detail. So the first thing you might say, these are all local O&Ds, so they have the same travel time. So easy enough, you might say, well, let's just distribute them equally. That's a reasonable thing to say. It's what we do today. And in fact, it works in most cases. In many cases, it works very well. The assumption here is that all the demand is similar, so it makes sense just to distribute that demand down to equally amongst the itineraries. That works out pretty well. However, what happens if the demand doesn't distribute itself equally? So in that case, we've distributed 25% of the demand to the 8:30 and 25% to the 9:30, but in reality, that's not how the demand typically books. So what we've done in that case is we've put too much of a forecast on the 8:30 and the 9:30 and not enough forecast on the 8 and the 9, and ultimately that's going to affect the availability that gets seen, and downstream we're going to open up too much on the 8 and the 9, not enough on the 8:30 and the 9:30. So not a good thing. So what also happens if the 9 a.m. flight just disappears? Well, it doesn't just disappear, of course, but what if I don't operate the 9 a.m. flight anymore? Of course, we could just say, instead of 25, 25, 25, 25, we do a third, a third, a third. Well, again, but look at what happens whenever I lose the 9 a.m. flight. I gain more information by seeing what happened, and I can better understand how the demand moves whenever one of the itinerary, one of the choices in the customer choice model, moves whenever I do that. So how are we going to move forward? Well, we're going to use science to do that. And of course, you've heard plenty about Pro's science, and that's something that is the bread and butter of our forecast engine and how we get that higher level forecast. And now we want to take that down to this lower level of detail and use it for this choice model. So instead, what do? We use all of this vast historical information, and we figure out that we need to put about 42% of the demand at 1, 17, 35, and 6. And again, I'll be honest, I made up the numbers, of course, because those are just those 4 random-looking people up there. But the idea behind it is we use this vast amount of information in order to determine how the demand has distributed itself historically and use that in the future. And it also has a lot of benefits too. So whenever that 9 a.m. flight disappears out of the schedule, when it disappears out of the schedule, what's going to happen whenever I lose that information? Now I also know what choices were made when these were the 3 options available in the history. So when I know that those are the 3 options, I can see how do I adjust the demand based on when those 3 options when those were the 3 options that were available. So it's a really robust model that really understands what are the choices and how do I distribute the demand down to that level. The real benefit of this comes in, instead of having to forecast at that really low level of detail. So for example, I might want to set up forecast groups instead of an 8 a.m. to a 10 a.m. I might have to set up a 7:55 to an 8:05, an 8:05 to an 8:15, and so forth, setting up those really small buckets. And that's a really low level of detail to manage. In this case, we get to manage that high level bucket, my morning traffic, and then distribute it out, let the system determine the optimal way of distributing it down to that level of detail. But our new choice model doesn't just stop there. It also extends to when there's one particular departure time, but there's multiple itineraries that could be an option. So in this case, we have Houston to Berlin via London, and I only have one departure a day to London. So in that case, it's DZ200. And I have options to connect on 405, 407, or 409. So how do you determine which itinerary gets the most demand? Well, the most logical case would be you distribute it, the most demand goes to the shortest travel time, second most to the second, and third, and so forth. And that's how most of us like to go, right? Nobody really wants to spend a whole lot of time in London just hanging out, so we probably go ahead and take the shortest travel time. But in reality, what if the demand doesn't actually distribute itself that way? So again, my cool animation where it doesn't distribute itself. So in this case, more people are picking the middle travel time. So again, it might be kind of weird. You might say, well, who's actually doing this? There's actually a couple different business cases that we've talked to different airlines about. And one of them is the idea that a passenger is just not comfortable with the minimum connection time. So the minimum connection time may be 2 hours, but passengers just historically aren't comfortable with that, and so they book the little longer one just to guarantee they give themselves enough time. That one's not really all that interesting of a business case. The more interesting business case is there are some airlines around the world that are promoting staying longer at their airport. And so we want to capture that. I mean, they give out gift cards to stick around the airport, spend a few dollars, and take the 8-hour connection. Now, I'm not a big fan of hanging around airports just for fun, but apparently it's working. And so we want to be able to capture that sort of demand. When passengers are choosing to stay longer at the airport, we want to be able to capture that and distribute the demand appropriately. So here in this case, again, my made up numbers, but the demand is not necessarily distributed shortest to longest. So the next feature that we want to talk about is what we're calling DCP grouping or DCP clustering. And the idea behind this feature is saying we have a really great amount of information between all of the different DCPs, and we want to share information across those. So I'm going to put up a nice picture to talk to here. This is from our system. This is a booking curve, obviously. And so the way that the DCP patterns work and the O&D forecaster works today is that we learn information about what happens in DCP 1 in order to help know what's going to happen in DCP 14. Okay? And in this case, just as a note, this is an incremental booking curve, so it's not cumulative, in case you were wondering why my booking curve doesn't look normal. So that's the way the forecaster works, is we share information from DCP 1 over to DCP 14. And that's particularly important whenever there's little observations in DCP 14. And the reverse is true. So we use information from DCP 14 whenever we're forecasting DCP 1. And again, it's really important whenever you have very few observations in DCP1, you're trying to decide what should I do, how should I forecast, what should I expect here when I just haven't seen a lot of information. And it's a really great property of the forecaster. It's something that allows us to kind of share that information across, and it's been a very valuable tool. But as we've been rolling out hybrid, we've started to see that maybe there's a little too much sharing going on. I don't think you learned that in kindergarten. I don't think there's ever such a thing as too much sharing. But in this case, there might be. So I do have jokes occasionally, so it is okay to laugh every once in a while. It's all right. So whenever we have that too much sharing going on, we want it to, it's especially problematic in our hybrid case. And hybrid is when we forecast that buy down that happens in a dependent demand situation. So in that business case, what we end up having is you're not only sharing the booking information, but you're also sharing the priceability, the price sensitivity of the particular DCPs across. So what that's saying is that the price sensitivity in DCP1 is going to influence the price sensitivity in DCP14, especially when I haven't seen a lot of price sensitivity in DCP14. So that can be a little bit problematic. We're oversharing that information. So the simple answer is we're going to stop doing that. And the more complicated answer is we're going to group these DCPs together into periods of time when we want to share that information. So in this case, we feel like DCPs 1, 2, and 3 are very much similar, so we want to share the information across those. DCPs 4 through 7 are similar, so we want to share information across those, and so forth as we go down. And this prevents us from having the situation where there's valuable information in DCP1. We still want to share it, but we want to share it with a limited portion of the rest of the booking curve. So just a quick summary, the DCP patterns the DCPs, and this is really important, the DCPs themselves are still where we're getting the majority of the information from. So the observations that I get from the DCPs is where I'm getting most of the information. Where this really comes into play is when I haven't observed a lot of information in certain DCPs, I need to make some assumptions about it. And when I make those assumptions, I want to do it in the best way possible. And this sharing across DCPs helps us with that. And then, of course, just mentioned, but the configurability across market is something else we're adding with this. So if you have different markets where you feel like long haul versus short haul behaves differently or would group together differently, we'd be able to create those different groupings. So again, a really valuable feature that we're adding to the system. The last feature that I want to talk about is the improved availability by considering bookability of classes. Again, not great at naming features. That one's basically a paragraph, the name is, but it's very much described in the feature name. What we're doing here is availability is extremely important in the O&D system. In yesterday's O&D session, we saw a little bit from Etihad where they explained their hybrid process that they were working on, and they talked a lot about the availability data. And we use it as an input into our system in order to get accurate unconstraining, accurate priceable and yieldable numbers. So it's really important. And so we collect that availability data. We also tie directly into RTDP. RTDP is, of course, the best way to get availability. Carlos, a little plug for Carlos's next session, of course. Remember those jokes, all right? All right. So we tie directly into RTDP so that we can get that information over into the system. So of course, if RTDP is the best way to calculate availability for the outside world, it's also the best way for O&D to get availability. So now when RTDP gets availability, it just answers the question of, yes, it's available, no, it's not, based on a fare versus a bid price. So, and not to simplify what RTDP does, but that is one aspect of what it does. But let's take a look at an example that will help illustrate what the situation is. So I have some basic pricing data. This example is extremely basic. I have 3 classes, and I can see on my third class, K class, there's a advanced purchase rule for 21 days. When the PCFV process runs inside of O&D, its job is to take a whole big set of pricing data and determine daily fares. So in this case, I get some daily fares that come out. And let's say that we're within that advanced purchase rule, or advanced purchase period. And so in this case, the O&D system, even though I'm within the period of time of the AP rule, I still get a daily fare of $200. And the reason for that is various different rules inside of PCFV, like the fare fill-up logic or interpolation, are going to run, and I'm always going to get a fare. That's the job of PCFV, is to always make sure you get a fare. So we get a fare, great, right? No problem. RTDP runs through and it tells us that with a bid price of $150, K, Q, and V are all available, no problem, right? So we go and we look at the bookings we got. So here we see the bookings. We got 8 bookings in V, 10 in Q, and K got 0 bookings. Now we're not really surprised that K got 0 bookings, right? We know that there's not a way to book that class, but we still think it's open. And you say, okay, well that's not really that big of a deal. But it actually does turn out to be a big deal, because in reality what we do in the hybrid system is we have to figure out, is Q class available or not? And we're trying to determine, are the passengers who are buying Q class price sensitive or not? Or are they product sensitive? So in this case, it looks like I got 10 bookings in Q class, even though a lower class was available. That's going to mean I'm going to classify all 10 of those bookings as product sensitive. They care about the product, not about the price. But in reality, we all know that's not true, because of course they actually were buying the lowest fare in the market. So how do we kind of fix this situation? We're going to use the fact that the K class had an AP rule and that we filled in that fare, and we're going to count that fare as ineligible. And we're going to send that information over to RTDP, and it will return an answer back to O&D that says that fare is not bookable. And we'll use that bookability information whenever we're calculating the availability. So here you can see that instead of 8 and 10 and 0 with closed, or with open as the lowest class, we see that it's actually closed. And all that means now is that we're better able to detect that that 10 is price sensitive demand. So all of these things that we've talked about here, the 3 features, are really all about improving the forecast. There's a statement of junk in, junk out, right? So all of this is really about making sure the data that's going into the forecast is of high quality, so that what you get out of the forecast is high quality. So we're really trying to improve those inputs and get that incremental next value out of the system to make sure you have a really stable set of information going in and the resulting data coming out. All 3 of these features really relate to our forecasting side, and in particular, very closely relate to hybrid. So hybrid's been a theme of the week. It's something that's a really awesome tool, and we got a great look into that yesterday from Etihad, and we know that it's really gaining traction, and so we're continuing to build up the way that hybrid works inside in the product. So as I mentioned, these aren't the only 3 features that we're working on. Of course, I wouldn't have much to do if those were the only 3 features we were working on. But I want to highlight to those of you that are our customers, we do have quarterly webcasts put on by our marketing team, and the product management team is always there to talk about what we just released in the last quarter, as well as what we're planning for the next quarter. And we also try to throw in some things that are a little more long-term as well. So a lot of really cool things that we're working on. It's a great way to stay in touch, and we always appreciate having people on those things so that I'm not just talking to myself. I'm not very good at talking to myself. So that was the first half, the things that are more short-term, close in. What about the stuff that's long-term? And that's what we want to talk about next. And so this is where we're going with the future of passenger revenue management. But before we can talk about the future, it's always good to look at where we've come from. So this is a timeline that I put together. And many of you are very familiar with Pro's history. You are founders of Pro's just along with the Pro's team, where you were using P3, P4 back in the mid-90s and really getting value out of the system back then. And so this is a quick timeline and roughly where certain things happened. And you can really see that P3 and P4 took us all through the 90s and really was the foundation of Pro's, the leg-based system that really took us into where we are today. And it really established Pro's as the leader in revenue management. And around 2000, that's when we introduced our O&D product. And at the time, it was just called O&D. We subsequently went back and named it O&D 3 after we introduced O&D 2. Remember that thing I mentioned about us being good at naming things? But I wasn't there in 2000, so I can't take credit for that. But so anyways, we introduced O&D in 2000, and that was a true revolution in the industry. No one else was doing O&D forecasting, and that's when Pro's introduced the idea. We used P&R data as the input, and we ultimately created O&D level forecast and generated these forecasts that no one else had done before. And it introduced the idea of network optimization and bid price control directly into the environment through a dynamic program. So truly revolutionary there. In the mid-2000s, we introduced O&D Hybrid. And so we've been talking a lot about hybrid, and we've talked a little bit about how it's just now gaining traction. And so you might wonder, well, if you introduced it in 2005, why is it just now getting traction? The reason is that it took a lot of time for people to start getting comfortable with O&D control first, and now we're getting to the point where people are ready to make that next step. And that's what you saw before, we're really there to help enable those other things to make sure that we make that next step into hybrid. Also in the mid-2000s, we introduced P6 as an upgrade from P5, obviously, and then into O&D 2 as well. And O&D 2 is our kind of combined solution between getting some flavor of network optimization and O&D control, but not going all the way to the PNR-based forecasting and optimization. So you get a little bit of O&D control without the full solution, and it uses components from P6 as well as from O&D. Now, there's not a line in 2010, but something truly revolutionary happened in 2010. I was hired then. No, I'm just, that was my best joke, so I'm glad it got a little bit of a laugh there because that was my best one. I was hired in 2010, but that probably wasn't the most revolutionary thing. But I would like to think that as a product manager for O&D, we've continued evolving the product as we go. And the big step that we made in 2010 was we started offering a cloud solution. And at the time, it was called hosting, and that was where we took the data and we were responsible for the operations and all of the things that went involved in that. And even that offering has continued to evolve over the last few years, where now we're working with providers, we're doing the SaaS-based solution and all of that. And it's been a true revolution in how we can provide the solution to our customers, and it's really been awesome. So that takes us into the future. But again, before we go to the future, I like to do a little bit of a throwback, just people who haven't used P6 for a while. We've got a few screenshots for you guys, and you can see how P6 kind of evolved into O&D. So this is the same kind of decision support screen and the flight summary screen that we had before, but kind of an evolution. And you can already see how the technology changed and how we got a little bit different look and feel. And as things moved through in O&D, we also started introducing more information around the fare evaluation piece, and then we introduced analytics as well. And the one thing you'll start noticing is that there's a whole lot more color in the system, so that's always nice, right? A little flashiness, a little color. And so you can see there's been a nice evolution of the product as we go from P6 and into O&D, and it's not just the color that makes a difference, but it's also the whole suite of products that we have. So, when we look at what we have today, we have PRMS, O&D 3, and O&D 2, all offered out there in the industry right now, and people using those. And as you all know, there's a very different look and feel between the three of them. There's very different functionality between the three of them. And we're also now at a point where we've talked a lot about dynamic pricing. And so that's the question now is, where do we put dynamic pricing? So we've got to build it. We know it's the future. We know it's what we want to do and we want to implement. So where do we put it? Do we recreate the same functionality in PRMS and O&D 2 and O&D 3, duplicating that work? Of course not. So how are we going to roll that out? Well, we're going to roll that out through what we're calling editions of the same product. So instead of having 3 distinct products, we're going to have a single product where there's multiple editions. And this concept is very similar to other software products that you've seen out there today. The one I always like to use, it's especially relevant in the US, but we did our taxes last month. Hopefully you did your taxes last month if you live here. They come after you for that, I think. But one of the software things that you can use is called TurboTax. And whenever you buy TurboTax, you can buy the Premium Edition, the Elite Edition, and the Platinum Edition. And it's the same product. And as you move through and you want more functionality, you can buy on the spot up to the next edition. And so that's the kind of thing that we're offering here. Now, it probably won't be quite as seamless as just swiping your credit card and you get the next edition. There might be a little more implementation time in there. But that is one of the components that we want to talk about with these editions. So the next natural question is well, what do I get in each of these editions? And so you'll see they kind of build off of each other. RM Essentials is essentially a replacement for our P6 product, okay, and our O&D 2 product. So it's leg and seg-based forecasting and optimization, along with the network optimization and bid price control that you get out of O&D 2 today. And we also want to introduce, long-term, we want to introduce the class-based ancillary pricing. So ancillaries are a big hot topic. That's a focus of research for my team as well as our science team at Pros. So it's a big thing that we're looking at and moving towards in the future. So you'll see kind of ancillaries as a topic on here that we want to talk about. As you move into RM Advantage, that's essentially a replacement for O&D 3. So it's O&D-based forecasting using PNRs. It's network optimization and bid price control through the LP and the DP. We also still have the class-based ancillary revenue handling. And then we also have the ability to use the cognitive stuff that we talked about in the morning session today. We saw a first introductory picture of that, and this is where we would start rolling out that functionality. As we move forward into RM Ultimate, that's really where we start talking about dynamic pricing. And that's where we want to say, if you're going to use dynamic pricing, you go to the RM Ultimate side. But remember, all of these things build off of each other. We want to live in a world where you can have a market on traditional forecasting, class-based, a market on hybrid forecasting that's class-based, and another market that's on using dynamic pricing without classes. Because we know that not all markets are going to be able to just move directly to dynamic pricing without classes. We know that that's going to be a process that rolls out, and we want to have some flexibility there. So what does dynamic pricing really mean? It's a topic around here today, of course. But dynamic pricing for us in the RM passenger space really means we want to forecast through a willingness to pay methodology. So again, that's a kind of generic statement. But what we're talking about there is, instead of forecasting at fixed price points, we want to forecast at the price paid by the passenger. And the hope is that that price is varying and gives us a nice smooth demand curve to show us, as we get certain at certain prices, we get certain demand. And we want to forecast that information as we go. We take those forecasts that come out of the system through using the same Bayesian forecasting technology that we use today. So it's the same basic framework and the thing that's tried and true and tested in the industry, and we're reworking that with a different model type to capture this willingness to pay methodology. Of course, then once you calculate those forecasts, we have to throw them into an optimizer and get out of that bid prices. And so again, the output is still the same. It's still bid prices, but we're using no classes in order to get that, because that's one of the things that we want to get to, is a class-free world. But we also want to still generate bid prices. And then those bid prices go into our RTDP Ultimate Edition, and I'm previewing Carlos's slide. I won't stay up here and talk for Carlos as well, but just a little preview for what you'll see there. That goes into the RTDP Ultimate Edition, where you can get dynamic pricing through RTDP. And that's the idea of actually quoting that price that you want to sell. So this is a quick picture of how we see all of this fitting together. Of course, all of this sits inside of the Microsoft Azure cloud, so we want to be fully cloud-based. And within the system, the boxes on the left are green, and those represent the input data that we get from other systems. So that's still the usual things like P&Rs, inventory, schedule, all of that kind of thing. But we also would enhance those things to include the price paid. And that's really important. At the passenger level, we want to understand exactly what the passenger paid. That becomes important in the dynamic pricing world. And then, of course, in the class world, you still need RA data, pricing data, all the reference data, and maybe even some data that you have in your system from external sources. The blue boxes, the light blue boxes all represent other products at Pros that the O&D system or the RM suite of editions would work together with. And so within that, we have our storage mechanism that we store all of this data. And then instead of having one kind of common set of services inside of O&D, what we'll have is a set of services that everybody can share. And this really goes towards that cloud-based model, where instead of having a forecaster in O&D, Pros has a forecasting service. And everybody that needs to use that calls that forecasting service in the cloud. It runs that information, processes it, and sends it back into O&D. O&D's job is to be the airline-specific side of things. The forecaster's job is to take all of that information, process it, and spit it out. Its job is the number cruncher. O&D's job is to be the expert in airline revenue management. And the same is true from the optimizer side as well as from the fair valuation side. And of course, all of these things interact seamlessly between RTDP as well as GSO. So the benefits of this really come into play in a couple different ways. We want a common technology across all of these, and that was the first thing I mentioned about the differences between P6, O&D2, and O&D3, is that the technology is different between them. Now, in some ways that benefits me, because I only have to manage one product, but of course we don't make decisions about what makes my life easier, despite my best attempts. But what we're actually trying to do is make your life easier by doing these things. And so what we're looking at are easy migrations to these products. So we want to make it easy if you're not a customer today, we want to make it easy to come to these products, or to these editions. And we also want to make it easy when you're moving between the editions. And when we talk about easy, what we're talking about is being able to worry just about getting the new data that you need, and not worrying about like a brand new look and feel, a new interface, and all of those things that come with a new product. We want to make it seamless across those. And part of that seamless functionality would be a common workflow. And so now you may say, well, a common workflow, how can you do the same thing in a leg-based system as you do in an O&D-based system as you do in a dynamic pricing system? Well, what we found is that there are some commonalities between these, and we want to make sure that we're accounting for those in the workflow. So we talked to a variety of different customers. We sat down with the users, talked to them, understood what it is that they're doing, understand their business cases, and what drives their work. And so what we've come up with is a set of screens, prototypes that we kind of feel put together a workflow for the forecasting side. And so one thing that you'll see is that there's a set of dimensions that are at the top, and those dimensions in this case are very specific to leg-based forecasting, but they also can easily be changed for the O&D side. But the meat, the thing that the user wants to look at, doesn't change whether it's revenue or whether it's O&D based or leg-based or dynamic pricing. So let's take a quick look. So of course you got to sign in. That's always important, right? But I always, you say, okay, well, why are you putting a login screen on this? Well, the login screen is important here because it tells the system who it is that's logging in. And again, that's important from a security standpoint and all those important things. But it's also important because the first thing that we want to do is we want to present the user with information that's immediately relevant to them. And so the first screen that you'll see, and Dan actually earlier in that presentation stole my slide. That's very nice of him, right? But in this case, what we're trying to show is these are the markets that I own. Again, with my naming thing, the name of this screen is called My Markets because they are the markets that I own. So with my markets, I understand what is exactly assigned to me, what am I responsible for, and I can quickly get an understanding of which markets are doing well and which markets need more attention. So in this case, it's a heat map where red represents something that's not so good and blue represents something that is okay. The metrics that we could choose from here are a variety of different things. They could be revenue-based metrics, or they could be bookings-based metrics, and in this case, we're showing an alert score. So the user will have set up some alerts, they understand what's going on in the market, and they score those alerts to say, if this thing happens, make it really bad, if this, it's not as bad, and we sum up those alerts to account for that here. Excuse me. From here, I might choose a particular market, and I want to get a quick overview of it. So this is what we're calling the market card. It's a quick piece of information about the market, understanding what's going on. The nice looking, we call it a river chart because it looks like a little blue river running through some sand there. It shows me what my current bookings are on hand right now against last year's bookings at the same time, plus or minus 10%, and that's what gives me those bands that go through there. So I get a quick understanding of what's going on in the market, and a quick view and decide here, well, okay, yeah, it's red, but I don't really need to do anything about it, or maybe I actually need to take a quicker look. So I'm going to take a quicker look, we'll dive into it, and here we get what we call the market overview page. And this is a deep dive into all the different things that might pertain to this market. So you have the alerts, triggered alerts that are up here at the top left. We have some key metrics with comparison back to the previous year. As we scroll down, we still see that year-over-year bookings. Maybe if we scroll down. There we go. If we scroll down, we see the year-over-year bookings, as well as some what we're calling generic mix charts. So seeing by time of day, by point of sale, by classes if you have classes enabled, by passenger type, all the different metrics that are important to the user, we'd be able to kind of see a pie chart that's based on those. And then at the bottom, something that shows you your average fare by departure date, giving the user an idea of what's going on. And again, these are just prototypes. This is part of the research that we're doing, going out and talking to people and seeing, well, what do you look at and what would be valuable on the screen? These are some of the ideas we've come up with, and we're going to be continuing to work with customers to find out what can we do to continue enhancing these. Now from here you decide, I really need to get a good look into the forecast. I need to understand exactly what's going on in the market from a forecast perspective. So this next chart is something you've seen before where you've, and this is what we call the historical forecast chart. It shows you your history on the left, your forecast on the right, and it gives you a quick overview of what's going into the forecast engine and what ultimately comes out. And so from this chart, the idea is the same way that it's relevant today in standard analytics that you have in O&D, we want to make it relevant in the future. It's not going away, whether you're forecasting dynamic price, willingness to pay without classes, or whether you're forecasting at a leg level or O&D level, it's all still relevant. You want to understand the inputs into the forecast and what comes out of the forecast. And this chart really helps do that here. Now, one important thing, as I talked about, this isn't just analytics here. This is a complete workflow. And so what we're going to do on every screen that's relevant from a demand perspective, we're going to continue and down at the bottom and show all of the influences and sponsorships and HSEs that are all relevant to this market. So in the system today, if you do your analysis and analytics, you get a lot of great information, but you have to go to another screen in order to understand what's pertaining to that market. What do I already have in place in that market? Now, instead of having to bounce between the two screens, we want to always carry this information along with it. So down here at the bottom, you can see I have a few multiplicative influences and a lot of different things going on for school holidays, all those different adjustments. And what we want to do is we want to allow you to highlight those, and it will show you the point on the chart that is actually relevant to that. So if it's a certain set of departure dates, you'd highlight over it. It would show you those departure dates that it pertains to. You'd also be able to see any HSEs, holidays and special events, demand mapping, sponsorships, all the things that might apply to this market you get with the whole screen. And again, it's all about being a workflow in this case. So I'm going to have to go pretty quick because I am running out of time. But this is a booking curve screen. I showed you the booking curve earlier that's in the system today. Again, same concept, but we're putting it into a workflow in this case. We're not just doing analytics, we're enabling the whole workflow of the user. And again, down at the bottom, influences by entity, that's what we call this because it's the influences by a given entity. Again, experts at naming things exactly as they are. And the next screen is a mix chart here. So it's just a generic mix chart. It's just showing you by different days of week, compartments, point of sale, time of day, all the different dimensions of the forecast engine, getting an understanding of what's going in so that you can better understand the market. And just because I'm thorough, influences by entity still comes along for the ride. And the last screen is really important for dynamic pricing specifically. And so this is where you actually get to see the demand curve. So I get to see the bookings by fare or by price. And so I can see how many bookings will I get at each price point. And this is what's important in O&D for enabling dynamic pricing into RTDP. So it's really getting that continuous demand curve and being able to actually come up with a dynamic price. And this would be fed over into RTDP along with those bid prices and help us calculate the dynamic price. So that was quick. I literally have 5 seconds left on this clock that's counting down here. And influences by entity came along for the ride, of course. So just to kind of wrap up, I think we've talked a lot about a lot of different things today, and I think the important thing here is that we really try to balance the focal point between being the near term and the long term, making sure that we're not just focusing on what the immediate needs are right now, but making sure that we understand that the dynamics of the industry are going to change, and we don't want to be behind on that. We want to stay ahead, so we have resources committed to working on the things that are really important right now, as well as where we're going in the future, so that we make sure we're balancing those things. And hopefully this roadmap highlighted that. As I had intended to have some time for questions, but unfortunately I have to not do that. But I will be at the networking booths in the exhibition hall, so feel free to stop by if you have any questions. Always happy to answer those. So thank you very much.